The opening overture, a journey to the interior self. As the world outside settles into its nightly hush, allow your mind to drift gently away from the demands of the day. We are about to embark on a unique journey, a descent into the profound and turbulent intellectual landscape of Fyodor Dostoevsky. His work is not merely literature. It is a sacred text of the human condition, a map of the soul's deepest mysteries. Imagine the pervasive gloom and gaslight, shadows of 19th century imperial St. Petersburg. This is the crucible where Dostoevsky forged his vision. It was a city of stark contradictions, of magnificent palaces and crushing poverty, of soaring spiritual aspirations and suffocating bureaucratic coldness. Dostoevsky was a man who lived through these extremes, facing a firing squad, only to have his sentence commuted at the last second, enduring years of Siberian exile, and battling personal demons of gambling and epilepsy. His philosophy is thus not an abstract, intellectual exercise. It is wisdom forged in the furnace of extreme suffering. Tonight we explore him not as a historical figure, but as a guide. He walks us through the darkest corridors of human consciousness, revealing truths about freedom, evil, and redemption that the 20th and 21st centuries have only begun to fully articulate. He is the psychologist who predated Freud, the existentialist who preceded and the political prophet who warned the world about seductive dangers of totalitarian utopias. Let your breathing become slow, deep, and even with every exhale, release the tension held in your body. We are moving beyond the noise of the superficial world and entering the eternal questions that define what it means to be human. Allow the rhythm of these ideas to soothe your anxious mind and prepare the way for rest. Our journey begins at the very foundation of his thought, the terrible gift of absolute freedom, the absolute burden. Dostoevsky's doctrine of freedom, the most defining and perhaps most frightening pillar of Dostoevsky's philosophy, is his radical insistence on absolute freedom. To understand this concept, we must first recognize the philosophical backdrop of his time. The mid-19th century was dominated by burgeoning scientific theories, particularly determinism. This view suggested that human actions, our choices, our feelings, even our thoughts, were merely the inevitable results of complex, external factors, genetics, environment, economy, economic conditions, and unconscious drives. If determinism were true, then terms like moral choice, guilt, and responsibility would be essentially meaningless, relics of a less informed age. Dostoevsky fiercely rejected this premise. He argued that the human spirit possesses an irreducible core of choice that cannot be entirely accounted for by scientific formulae or societal pressures. This is the metaphysical core of the human being, the condemnation to be free. Dostoevsky's characters repeatedly demonstrate that even when faced with overwhelming external pressures, the will retains the power to choose. In Notes from Underground, the narrator defiantly states that if a scientific formula could ever perfectly calculate every future action of man, man would immediately perform some insane, irrational act simply to prove that he is still free, that he is still the master of his own destiny, and not merely a piano key, played by the laws of nature. This means that we are condemned to be free. Freedom is not right we possess, it is a burden we cannot escape. Even the decision to surrender our agency, to follow an authority blindly, to yield to addiction, or to blame our actions entirely on our past, is itself a continuous exercise of freedom. We are perpetually haunted by the spectre of what we could choose freedom and moral meaning. This absolute freedom is terrifying, precisely because it makes us absolutely responsible. If our actions are determined, then no moral judgment can be rendered. But Dostoevsky argued that this freedom is precisely what gives human life its transcendent value. He asked the profound question, often explored in the text of divine or existential justice: why would a creator or existence itself place such a crushing weight upon fragile human beings? Lies in the necessary link between freedom and virtue. The answer: a creature forced into goodness is merely functional. A creature that chooses goodness, despite the availability of evil, is morally significant. The capacity for profound evil is the prerequisite for the capacity for profound love. Consider the characters who choose redemption, like Sonia Marmeladova or Alyosha Karamazov. Their goodness is earned because they possess the inherent freedom to choose a life of corruption, pride, or nihilism, yet they deliberately choose the path of active love and self-sacrifice. They elevate human existence beyond mere biology or sociology. This concept of freedom, therefore, is the direct source of our greatest existential anguish. It is the root cause of our anxiety, our guilt, and our chronic self-doubt, because every action we take is irrevocably ours. Dostoevsky forces us to confront the fact that we are the soul, architects of our souls. The terrible cost of choice. Dostoevsky understood that if man is truly free, he is also free to choose suffering, madness, and self-destruction. This is the terrible cost of choice. His novels are filled with characters who abused their freedom, not for pleasure, but for the sheer, destructive thrill of asserting that freedom. When Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, chooses murder, he is fundamentally testing this freedom. He is asking, does morality truly bind the exceptional man, or can I use my free will to transcend the common law and declare myself an extraordinary man? The ensuing psychological collapse is Dostoevsky's resounding answer. The moment Raskolnikov asserts his absolute freedom through an immoral act, he paradoxically becomes a slave to his own conscience, and his resulting isolation, the self-inflicted prison of his own mind, is the ultimate price of misused freedom. This exploration of this freedom is the primary subject of Dostoevsky's great novels. Every tragic event, every moment of profound suffering, is ultimately traced back to an act of absolute, individual choice. The internal chaos of his characters is simply the reflection of the limitless, terrifying, beautiful chaos of their own free will. This is the burden we carry, and the truth we must accept to finally find rest. The paralysis of hyperconsciousness, the underground man, If the core of Dostoevsky's vision is freedom, the central tragedy of the modern, intellectualized man is his misuse of that freedom, often leading to a state Dostoevsky diagnosed decades before modern psychology, hyperconsciousness or excessive self-awareness. This affliction is perfectly embodied by the narrator of Notes from Underground. The underground man is a man, crippled by his own intelligence. He is a genius of self-analysis. Yet this genius proves to be his undoing. He is defined by his profound inability to simply act. Where most people operate on the momentum of instinct, belief or habit, the underground man's mind intervenes with an endless cascade of objections, qualifications, and alternative motives. Every potential action is dissected until the energy required to perform it is completely exhausted. This is the condition of analysis paralysis. Raised to a spiritual level, he is trapped in a vicious, self-sustaining loop. He recognizes the absurdity and misery of his isolation. Yet his intellect immediately provides countless for why attempting to change would be futile, hypocritical, or beneath his perceived intellectual superiority. The war against logic and utility, the underground man's greatest hatred, is reserved for the simple, rational, and utilitarian worldview that dominated 19th century thought. The belief that, if one simply demonstrates the objective truth and utility of an action, all people will logically choose it. He calls this the Crystal Palace, a symbol of a perfectly ordered, mathematically planned utopian society, where freedom and suffering are eliminated in favor of comfort and predictability. His profound defiance is the assertion that man, by nature, is irrational, and often prefers suffering and chaos to a perfectly engineered happiness. He argues that man's greatest need is not material comfort, but the need to affirm his own individuality and free will. If the Crystal Palace were ever built, he insists someone would deliberately smash it, just to prove they are not a piano key being played by the laws of nature. This destructive impulse is the assertion of insulted human freedom, the division of the self. The underground man's tragedy runs deeper than intellectual frustration. It is an internal spiritual schism. He cannot experience any emotion purely the moment joy, sorrow, or rage appears. His critical intellect immediately steps in to dissect and critique the feeling itself. Why am I feeling this? Is this feeling genuine? Or am I merely performing it for myself? This continuous self-monitoring creates a debilitating alienation from his own inner life. He becomes a stranger to himself, watching his thoughts and feelings as if they belong to someone else. He is perpetually divided against his own soul, with one part acting as the observer and judge over the other. This internal division renders authentic self-expression impossible. He can never truly connect with others, because every word, every gesture, is filtered through layers of calculation and anticipated social critique. His social interactions are inevitably forced, awkward, and humiliating, reinforcing his belief that solitude is the only viable form of existence. Nihilism as the intellectual abyss, the natural, philosophical endpoint of hyperconsciousness. when divorced from faith or action, is nihilism. Dostoevsky was preoccupied with this ideology because he saw it as the inevitable, intellectual byproduct of a rationalist attempt to dismantle absolute moral and spiritual truths. Nihilism in Dostoevsky's time was often characterized by the rejection of all established religious, moral, and social principles, leaving behind only the principles of pure reason and utility. The everything is permitted trap, the most terrifying philosophical implication of Dostoevsky's exploration of nihilism, is summarized in the phrase, "If there is no God, then everything is permitted." This is the central philosophical experiment, explored by characters across his works, particularly Ivan. Ivan, the intellectual skeptic, does not commit the murder of his father directly, but his theories, his reasoned dismantling of all moral absolutes, are provide the intellectual permission for his half-brother, Smerdikov, to carry out the crime. Dostoevsky demonstrates that the intellectual rejection of morality has real, tangible, and devastating consequences in the world. Ivan's tragedy is that his immense intellect has led him to a spiritual abyss. He understands the logical consistency of a world without moral restraints, but he cannot reconcile this logic with the human need for justice, compassion, and meaning. His mind is a landscape of chaos, culminating in fevered delirium and conversations with the devil, a manifestation of his own unacknowledged, nihilistic self, the challenge to human dignity. Dostoevsky's ultimate counter to nihilism is not a rational argument, but the assertion of human dignity through suffering and love. Characters who embrace nihilism, like Arkharilov in Demons, who seeks to affirm his freedom by committing suicide, or Raskolnikov in his pre-confession Arrogance, invariably find themselves utterly miserable and alienated. Their theory of freedom, intended to elevate them above humanity, instead plunges them into a deep, cold, inhuman solitude. The final message of Dostoevsky against nihilism is that the moral compass is not an external, fragile construct imposed by religion, but an internal, irreducible element of the human soul. When one attempts to deny that inner truth through intellectual arguments, the result is the catastrophic, psychological collapse of the self. The silence and despair of the nihilist is the direct result of a soul attempting to live by a logic that denies its own existence. Let these profound insights into the inner struggles of the rational mind guide your thoughts to a place of deeper understanding and eventual tranquility. Embrace the contradictions and find peace in the acknowledgement of your own complexity. The prophecy of totalitarianism, the seduction of perfect order. Dostoevsky's vision was not limited to the individual soul. He was perhaps the most frighteningly accurate political prophet of the 19th century, foreseeing the rise of the totalitarian impulse long before the Soviet Union or the fascist regimes of the 20th century. His prophetic warning is that political tyranny does not always arise from brute force, but often from a deeply seductive philosophical promise to relieve humanity of the burden of freedom. His characters, who embrace revolutionary or utopian socialist ideals, like Piotr Verkovensky in Demons, or the architects of the Crystal Palace, are not simply seeking social reform. They are seeking a mathematically perfect, predictable system that eliminates suffering. By eliminating choice, they want to create a world where human behavior is entirely rationalized and controlled, making the turbulent drama of the free spirit obsolete. This impulse, the desire for a universal total solution, is rooted in Dostoevsky's understanding of human weakness. He knew that for every Raskolnikov who asserted radical, destructive freedom, there were thousands who secretly longed for security, bread, and obedience over the agonizing responsibility of being free. The appeal of totalitarianism is that it offers the ultimate trade. Surrender your conscience, surrender your autonomy, and in return receive a simple, undeniable sense of belonging and guaranteed, if shallow happiness. Dostoevsky critiqued the core philosophical error of these utopian systems, the belief that human nature is infinitely malleable and can be perfected through the correct application of scientific theories and social engineering. He argued that any system that attempts to eliminate irrationality, spontaneity, and suffering will inevitably destroy the very thing that makes man human, his divine, irreducible free will. The grand lie, the great lie of the totalitarian regime, as Dostoevsky revealed, is that it claims to love humanity so much that it must protect it from itself. It sees the chaotic and suffering human as an inefficient error that must be corrected through absolute control. The tragic irony is that, in seeking to enforce a perfect society, these ideologues must inevitably commit horrific acts of violence and deception, proving the very evil of human nature. They sought to transcend the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, a spiritual masterpiece, the pinnacle of Dostoevsky's political and spiritual prophecy, is contained within the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, a famous chapter from the Brothers Karamazov. This is not merely a story. It is a compact philosophical treatise on the temptation to surrender freedom. The setting is 16th century Seville, where Christ miraculously returns. He is immediately arrested by the 90-year-old Grand Inquisitor, the highest ecclesiastical authority, who represents a power structure that has taken over the world. In Christ's name, the Inquisitor interrogates Christ, not out of hatred, but out of a deep, tragic compassion for humanity. The Inquisitor argues that Christ made a fatal error by giving humanity freedom when he refused the three temptations offered by the devil. In the desert, the temptation of bread miracle, the devil tempted Christ to turn stones into bread. By refusing, Christ asked men to follow him freely, without being bought by material guarantee. The Inquisitor argues that man only cares about bread and security. The Church, or the totalitarian state, must seize control of the bread supply to ensure universal obedience and happiness. The temptation of mystery authority. The devil tempted Christ to jump from the temple and be saved by angels, proving his power. By refusing, Christ demanded followers based on faith, not irresistible blinding authority. The Inquisitor argues that man needs mystery and absolute authority to bow down to, relieving them of the burden of individual moral judgment, the temptation of power conscience. The devil offered Christ all the kingdoms of the world. By refusing, Christ preserved man's individual conscience. The Inquisitor argues that man is terrified of conscience, and will gladly hand over the right to choose to a universal power in exchange for peace and certainty. The silent response, the core of the legend, is that Christ remains completely silent throughout the Inquisitor's long, impassioned speech. When the Inquisitor finishes, Christ's only response is to quietly kiss the old man on his bloodless lips. This act of silence and love is Dostoevsky's ultimate, non-intellectual refutation. It signifies that the answer to the Inquisitor's powerful logic cannot be found in more words or better arguments, but only in the spiritual power of unconditional love and forgiveness, which transcends all logic and all systems. The legend of the Grand Inquisitor is Dostoevsky's chilling masterpiece, serving as a perpetual warning. Beware of those who promise universal happiness by demanding the surrender of your soul's deepest, most terrible gift, your freedom. The Psychology of Guilt, Raskolnikov's fatal experiment. To fully grasp the consequence of misusing absolute freedom, we must turn to Rodion Raskolnikov, the central figure in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov is the logical extension of the hyper-conscious underground man, a brilliant, impoverished student whose intellect leads him to devise a catastrophic ethical theory. Raskolnikov believes in the extraordinary man theory. He posits that humanity is divided into two classes: the ordinary, the conservative majority, bound by moral law, and the extraordinary, the rare few, the Newtons, the Napoleons, who possess the moral right to transgress existing law, even to commit murder, if it serves a higher beneficial purpose for mankind. This theory is not just an act of intellectual vanity. It is Dostoevsky's profound attack on utilitarian ethics, the idea that the end justifies the means. Raskolnikov decides to test his theory by murdering the old pawnbroker, not out of greed, but as a philosophical experiment. He wants to prove to himself that he is, indeed, an extraordinary man, immune to the common moral weakness. He despises the failure of the theory. The moment Raskolnikov commits the murder, Dostoevsky reveals the fatal flaw in his theory. The true punishment for the crime is not the fear of the police or the legal system, but the immediate crushing, psychological and spiritual collapse that follows. His intellect, which created the theory, cannot save him from his conscience, which refuses to be silenced. Dostoevsky shows that the moral law is not a fragile, external construct imposed by society or religion. It is an internal structure of the human soul. When Raskolnikov attempts to violate this structure, he does not transcend humanity. He severs himself from it. He falls into a profound and suffocating solitude. The intellectual theory he thought would liberate him, instead traps him in a self-inflicted prison of guilt and terror. He is obsessed with his secret, unable to tolerate the sunlight, the noise, or the presence of other human beings. The psychological landscape of isolation Dostoevsky uses Raskolnikov's post-crime state to brilliantly map the psychological terrain of complete isolation. The man who believed himself a great, independent thinker finds himself utterly dependent on the presence of others, if only to push them away. The role of the investigator, Porfiry Petrovich, the psychological cat-and-mouse game between Raskolnikov and the masterful investigator, Porfiry, is not about gathering forensic evidence. It is a battle of wills and philosophies. Porfiry understands better than Raskolnikov understands himself. Porfiry represents the deep, intuitive and practical wisdom of the Russian soul, which recognizes that the law of conscience always wins. Porfiry's technique is to gently, psychologically pressure Rusk, not to arrest him but to guide him toward confession. Porfiry knows that Raskolnikov's suffering is already a far greater punishment than any penal servitude. He essentially gives Raskolnikov permission to confess, not as a legal necessity, but as a spiritual necessity for survival. Porfiry's actions underscore Dostoevsky's belief that justice must ultimately serve the healing of the soul, the contagion of suffering. Raskolnikov's suffering is not private. It is a contagion that affects everyone around him: his protective mother, his sacrificing sister Dunya, and especially the unfortunate Marmeladov family. Dostoevsky stresses the interconnectedness of human lives. No moral choice, especially an act of evil, is ever confined to the individual. The guilt, the shame, and the resulting chaos ripple outward, emphasizing that ethical existence is inherently communal. This psychological landscape, where pride fights compassion, where intellect battles conscience, and where isolation is more painful than any public sentence, is Dostoevsky's eternal clinic on the human psyche. He demonstrates that genuine well-being is only achieved when the soul willingly submits to the moral law that governs both the inner and outer world. The path out of this dark isolation can only be found through an act of shared suffering. Humanity, the redemptive power of active love, Sonia and life. While Dostoevsky dedicated much of his work to the pathology of intellectual pride and destructive freedom, his ultimate message rests on the antidote: active love, or the spontaneous, self-sacrificing compassion for others. This spiritual force is most purely embodied by two figures, Sonya, crime and punishment, and Alyosha, the brothers Karamazov. These characters are not distinguished by their brilliant intellects or their high social standing. They are defined by their profound humility and their unwavering capacity for empathy. Their wisdom is not theoretical but existential. They understand the nature of suffering and sin, yet they choose to respond with unwavering acceptance and shared responsibility. Sonya, the transformative power of suffering. Sonya Marmeladov, the tragic figure, forced into prostitution to support her family, is the spiritual center of crime and punishment. Her existence is a testament to Dostoevsky's belief that suffering, willingly embraced and endured, can lead to spiritual clarity and profound power. She embodies the Christ-like principle of bearing the cross for others. Sonya's philosophy is rooted in action and faith. Contrasting, sharply with Raskolnikov's destructive theory, rooted in abstract reason. When Raskolnikov finally confesses his crime, he attempts to explain his motive. Using his extraordinary man theory, Sonia's response is not a logical refutation, but a sudden visceral cry of pity and shared pain. She does not judge his sin. She judges the spiritual isolation. It caused her demand that he go at once. This very minute stand at the crossroads. Bow down, first kiss the earth which you have defiled, and then bow down to all the world, and say to all men aloud, I am a murderer. It is a demand for spiritual rebirth, is not merely a call for legal confession, required to reconnect the severed soul with the shared, a ritualistic act of public humility, human reality. Sonia teaches that true penance is found not in self-pity or intellectual analysis, but in the active assumption of responsibility and the subsequent suffering it entails. Alyosha, the ideal of the active monk. Alyosha Karamazov is presented by Dostoevsky as the potential Russian hero of the future. He is not defined by denial or withdrawal from the world, but by his active engagement with its chaos. Alyoid's spiritual path is laid out by his mentor, the elder Zosima. Elder Zosima's teaching is the theological bedrock of Dostoevsky's hopeful vision. Zosima preaches the doctrine of universal responsibility. Every one of us is responsible for everyone else's sins. This revolutionary concept shatters the individualistic pride of the hyperconscious man. It demands that instead of judging others or wallowing in personal guilt, one must actively seek to love and serve the world. Recognizing the shared spiritual fate of all humanity, Alyosha's life is an extension of this teaching. He moves seamlessly between the intellectual debates of his brother Ivan, the sensual chaos of his father Fyodor, and the emotional turmoil of his brother Dmitri. He absorbs their suffering, yet he's never corrupted by it. His power is derived from his ability to listen, to forgive, and to offer quiet, non-judgmental empathy. Alexa demonstrates that the highest form of freedom is not the radical assertion of the self, like Rusk, but the radical gift of the self to others. His path shows that sanctity is found, not in the monastery alone, but in the marketplace of human struggle, the necessity of shared suffering. Dostoevsky firmly believed that suffering was necessary for spiritual growth and redemption. This is why the journey of Rusk and the foundation of Sonia and Alyosha's virtue are inextricably linked to pain. Suffering acts as a crucible that burns away intellectual arrogance and selfish pride, forcing the individual to confront the truth of the soul by sharing the burdens of others, as Sonia does by following Raskolnikov to Siberia, and as Alyosha does by taking on the emotional debts of his family. These heroes achieve an authentic state of grace. Their love is not passive. It is an active, difficult labor that demands humility, patience, and courage. The tranquility offered by Dostoevsky is not the easy calm of escapism, but the profound peace that comes from the courageous acceptance of life's pain, and the transformation of that pain through radical, boundless compassion. This love, in the Dostoevskian sense, is the ultimate reality, stronger than all the logic, all the nihilism and all the totalitarian systems, the mind can invent the aesthetics of salvation. Prince Mishkin and the Idiot, after dissecting the intellectual failures of the underground man and providing the spiritual alternative in Sonia and Alia, Dostoevsky attempted his most daring philosophical experiment, creating a man who is perfectly good, a truly beautiful soul, and then placing him into the corrosive, the reality of the 19th century Russian aristocracy. This figure is Prince Mishkin, the protagonist of The Idiot. Mishkin is Dostoevsky's deliberate attempt to depict a truly Christian ideal in human form, often described by the author as a positively beautiful person. He is a man utterly devoid of the ego, pride, and intellectual complexity that plagued Dostoevsky's other heroes. Mishkin possesses genuine spontaneous love, childlike purity, and an uncanny ability to perceive the inner suffering of others. Paradoxically, these qualities, which Dostoevsky considers humanity's highest virtues, make him an object of confusion and pity. Hence the title, The Idiot, the conflict between ideal and reality. Mishkin's innocence is his tragic flaw. He enters the chaotic world of Petersburg society, armed only with compassion, a total lack of self-interest, and an almost superhuman capacity for forgiveness. He sees the intrinsic, divine beauty in every soul he meets, regardless of their sins or social standing. However, the world is incapable of processing such pure goodness. His honesty is mistaken for naivety, his forgiveness for weakness, and his compassion for intellectual deficiency that forces others. His presence acts as a powerful catalyst to confront their own hypocrisy and moral compromises. Dostoevsky uses Misha's experience to explore the devastating question, can pure divine beauty save a world defined by self-interest and intellectual pride? The narrative suggests a painful answer. While Mishkin saves individual souls, like the broken hip, by simply acknowledging their dignity, he ultimately fails to save the people he loves most. Nastasia Filipovna and Agloya, his efforts to mediate between them only intensify their passions, leading to madness, death, and his own final descent back into intellectual darkness, epilepsy, and catatonia. The failure of Michigan is Dostoevsky's tragic realization that goodness alone is not enough to compel the free will of others. Free will, the terrible gift, demands that people must choose to follow the light, and they are fully capable of choosing to reject it, even when confronted with its pure, unadulterated form. The power of beauty and the struggle for faith. Dostoevsky famously declared, "Beauty will save the world." This quote, often mistakenly taken as a simple aesthetic statement, must be understood through the lens of Prince Mishkin. For Dostoevsky, beauty is not merely artistic or physical. It is a spiritual and moral state. It is the harmony of a soul, reconciled with God and humanity, the visible manifestation of moral perfection. Michigan embodies this true spiritual beauty. The tragedy of The Idiot is that the world, blinded by lust, pride, and intellectual skepticism, mistakes the spiritual beauty for mere weakness or foolishness. Nastasia Philippovna, who recognizes Mishkin's purity, cannot bear her own perceived sinfulness, and, intentionally, drives herself away from the salvation he offers, choosing instead the destructive, passionate chaos of regret. Her inability to accept forgiveness shows that the intellectual concept of her own unworthiness is stronger than the simple reality of Mishkin's pure love, faith and doubt as dynamic forces. The characters in The Idiot are constantly struggling with the ultimate Dostoevskian question: how to reconcile the existence of suffering and evil with the belief in a benevolent God. Michigan is the pure expression of faith, yet his faith seems to suggest that the ideal cannot survive the reality of human freedom. This novel demonstrates that Dostoevsky's faith was not a simple, comforting certainty, but a tumultuous struggle, a constant, agonizing wrestling with doubt, exemplified by the intellectual torments of his anti-heroes. True faith, in Dostoevsky's view, is the decision to believe in the goodness of Christ's example. Despite the overwhelming evidence of human wickedness and the reality of pointless suffering, the final message from this section is that, while the existence of pure goodness, beauty should logically save the world, the unpredictable nature of free will means that salvation remains an individual, difficult choice, one that often rejects the easy light in favor of the complex, familiar darkness, the destructive force of atheistic revolution. The Demons, if Crime and Punishment, explored the nihilism of the individual. Dostoevsky's novel Demons, also translated as The Possessed, explores the nihilism of the collective, the terrifying trajectory of political and social radicalism. When divorced from spiritual and moral constraints, this novel serves as Dostoevsky's most direct and chilling political warning, anticipating the mechanisms of revolutionary terror and ideological fanaticism. The central theme of Demons is the devastating effect of ideas. Divorced from life, the radical conspirators are not motivated by true compassion for the poor, but by abstract, purely intellectual theories aimed at destroying the existing order, the old gods, to impose a utopian ideal, the new gods. Dostoevsky shows that when God is rejected, the resulting vacuum is immediately filled by the idolatry of power, science, and collective will. The pathology of Piotr Vetter, the chief architect of the chaos, is Piotr Vetter, a brilliant but utterly cynical manipulator. Piotr does not believe in the revolutionary ideology himself. He believes only in the mechanism of control, disruption, and the establishment of arbitrary authority. He is Dostoevsky's prototype of the modern, political operative, amoral, manipulative, and devoted to process over principle. Peter's goal is to create a social environment of chaos and fear, a state of perpetual anxiety that will lead people to crave an absolute dictator. He systematically undermines all social institutions, family structures, and moral beliefs, pushing people into a spiritual panic. He understands that humans, when terrified by total meaninglessness, nihilism, will gratefully surrender their freedom to the first charismatic figure who offers them a strong, simple answer. Chatov and the question of Russian identity. Contrasting Pieta's cynicism is the tragic figure of Ivan Chutov, a former radical, who attempts to reclaim a sense of national and spiritual identity. Shahov attempts to articulate a unique Dostoevskian thesis that every great nation, to be truly great, must possess its own unique spiritual God, or organizing idea distinct from others. Shadow's struggle reflects Dostoevsky's own late life, grappling with Russian orthodoxy and Slavophile beliefs. Shadow recognizes the era of the radicals. They are not true Russians, but merely westernized intellectuals importing abstract, dry rationalist ideologies, socialism, materialism, that are fundamentally alien to the deep, spiritual core of the Russian people. Shav's quest for spiritual truth makes him a dangerous apostate in the eyes of the group, leading to his inevitable senseless murder, an act Dostoevsky uses to reveal the true, murderous heart of ideological fanaticism, the metaphysics of suicide and Godman. The most profound philosophical exploration in Demons is found in the character of Kirill, a spiritual extremist who takes the premise of, if there is no God, everything is permitted, to its logical, tragic conclusion. Kirillov believes that the entire history of humanity, including the concept of God, has been predicated on the fear of death. He argues that the moment a man overcomes this fear, he becomes the man-God. Kirillov determines to demonstrate this freedom. By committing suicide, his logic is precise and chilling. If God exists, then all is his will. If God does not exist, then I am the will. The only way to fully assert absolute self-will, freedom, and crush the old false fear of death is through a completely conscious, self-willed act of ending one's life. Kirillov's suicide is thus not an act of despair, but an attempt at a metaphysical declaration. He sacrifices his life to prove a theoretical point, that man can achieve divinity by becoming entirely self-sufficient and overcoming the greatest human limitation, fear of mortality. Dostoevsky's tragedy of Kirillov is that this ultimate act of freedom leads to nothing but a meaningless, dark void. Kirillov's attempt to assert divinity only proves his profound isolation and failure to find true meaning. He is a martyr to an idea, proving that intellectual arrogance, even when sacrificing the body, cannot satisfy the soul's genuine need for connection and transcendental meaning. The narrative of Demons leaves the reader with a terrifying conclusion. The greatest threat to society and the individual soul is not simple wickedness, but ideas, rational, abstract theories that promise paradise, while systematically eliminating the moral, spiritual, and communal bonds necessary for genuine human life. The demons are not mythical beasts. They are the abstract, destructive ideas that possess the minds of the intellectuals. The challenge of evil Ivan Karamazov's rebellion, the deepest philosophical abyss in Dostoevsky's work, is plumbed by Ivan the brilliant, skeptical middle brother in the brothers Karamazov. Ivan is the ultimate intellectual nihilist, not because he wishes to destroy, but because he cannot reconcile reason with the reality of suffering. His great challenge is directed not at the state or society, But at the divine order itself, Ivan's conflict is rooted in the problem of evil. If a benevolent, all-powerful God created the world, how can the universe be so saturated with senseless suffering? Unlike Resk, who believes he can transcend morality, Ivan believes he cannot accept the moral reality of a world built upon such cruelty. The tear of the child, the limit of acceptance. Ivan famously states that he accepts the existence of God, but he rejects the ticket of entry to a heaven purchased at the price of human suffering. He brings forth a collection of journalistic anecdotes detailing the deliberate, sadistic torture of innocent children. He argues that the suffering of these children is the ultimate intolerable flaw in the cosmic design. He poses the question, even if the final, ultimate harmony of the universe depends on the suffering of one innocent child, even if that child's tear is necessary to complete the tapestry of meaning, would you consent to such a price? Ivan's answer is a resounding no. He declares that no future bliss, no ultimate truth, can ever justify the torment of an innocent being. This intellectual and moral rebellion is Dostoevsky's most powerful argument against his own spiritual worldview, demonstrating the terrifying honesty of his philosophical inquiry. Ivan recognizes that the intellectual attempt to justify this suffering, to explain it as a necessary part of God's plan, or a consequence of free will, is nothing but an act of intellectual arrogance. To accept such a justification is to become complicit in the evil. Therefore, Ivan asserts his ultimate freedom. By refusing to participate in a world based on such horror, the collision of atheism and faith, Ivan's rational rebellion sets up the core ideological conflict of the novel, contrasting the purely intellectual rejection of meaning with the spiritual acceptance embodied by his brother Alyosha and the elders. Ivan embodies the tragedy of the purely logical mind. His mind can deconstruct all moral claims and systems, leading him to the logically consistent conclusion that everything is permitted. Yet, this conclusion does not bring him peace or happiness. It drives him to madness. His internal chaos is so severe that it manifests externally as a detailed, chilling hallucination, the appearance of the devil, who is essentially a grotesque, cynical, and mundane manifestation of Ivan's own intellectual self-doubt and nihilistic theories. Zozima's counter-philosophy of embrace. The elder Zuzima offers the spiritual counter-argument to Ivan's intellectual one. Zozima does not attempt to explain the suffering of the child through complex theology. Instead, he offers a direct existential command: love the suffering. Zozima's wisdom is not about understanding the evil, but about overcoming its power through radical action. He teaches that the only way to genuinely respond to the tragedy of the innocent is not by intellectually rejecting the world, as Ivan does, but by actively loving the world and taking personal responsibility for its pain. He preaches that we must look at the child's tear and say, I am responsible for this suffering, and I will redeem it with my own love and service. This philosophy avoids the trap of rationalization. It transforms the question from, why did God allow this, to, What am I going to do about it? This shift from intellectual contemplation to active, sacrificial love is the foundation of Dostoevsky's ultimate hope. Ivan's failure lies in his inability to transition from powerful sympathy, a feeling of pity, to true compassion, a commitment to suffer with the victim. He loves humanity in the abstract, but cannot love the real messy, sinful human beings in front of him. His rejection of the world, though morally powerful, ultimately leaves him paralyzed and alone, in the grip of his own destructive logic, the philosophy of passion and the senses. Dmitri, if Ivan represents the failure of pure intellect, his brother Dmitri represents the complex, chaotic struggle of the sensual man. Dmitri is a figure consumed by passion, prone to fits of violent rage, and constantly oscillating between extreme degradation and soaring spiritual aspirations. He is Dostoevsky's exploration of the soul, that attempts to live solely by feeling and instinct, divorced from both strict logic and rigorous spiritual discipline. Dmitri's life is dominated by his passions, his love for Grushenka, his hatred for his father, and his desperate need for money. He is always driven by the instantaneous, overwhelming impulse of the moment. This lack of self-control is itself a failure of freedom, as he becomes a slave to his own immediate desires. He is constantly pursuing the wild, sensual, destructive Karamazov force within himself. Yet Dostoevsky does not condemn Dmitri entirely. Beneath the surface of his chaotic passion, Dmitri possesses a deeply intuitive sense of moral truth and a profound capacity for spiritual suffering. Unlike Raskolnikov or Ivan, Dmitri instinctively knows when he has sinned, and he yearns for purity, often reciting hymns and poems that glorify the sublime. Dostoevsky uses Dmitri's false conviction for his father's murder to illustrate a crucial philosophical point. Dmitri is guilty not of the physical crime, but of the spiritual desire for the crime. He is guilty of allowing the hatred for his father to possess his soul by accepting the punishment. Dmitri undergoes a profound spiritual transformation. He realizes that by suffering, he can redeem not only his own sins, but symbolically the sins of all humanity, who live by destructive passion. He transforms his suffering from a personal tragedy into an act of universal atonement. Rogojin and the consuming force of desire, the destructive potential of passion, is further amplified in the character of Parthian. Rogojin in The Idiot. Untamed and ultimately consuming desire, Rogojin is the embodiment of raw, while Dmitri's passion is chaotic, but contains a spark of moral awareness. Rogojin's passion for Nastasia Filipovna is a dark, primal force, a mixture of agonizing love, possessive lust, and murderous jealousy. Rogojin is the spiritual foil to Prince Mishin, where Michigan is pure detached compassion. Rogojin is pure attached instinct. The conflict between them for is Dostoevsky's dramatic staging of the war between faith, Michigan, passion, Rogojin for the possession of the soul. Nastasia Rogojin's love is so intense, so consuming that it can only end in destruction. He cannot accept the idea of sharing nest, or allowing her to be free. His passion, unchecked by any moral or intellectual framework, degrades into an absolute will to possess, leading inevitably to her murder and his own descent into madness. Dostoevsky demonstrates a vital through this character. Uncontrolled, purely sensual passion is inherently destructive. It narrows the soul, cuts it off from empathy, and ultimately leads to isolation and death. Rogerson's fate is the consequence of choosing to live entirely by the chaotic, animalistic impulses of the will, ignoring the higher call to reason and compassion, search for moral harmony. The contrast between the intellectual Ivan, the passionate Dmitri, and the purely destructive Rogatchin forms the complete, bleak portrait of the human soul's struggle. In Dostoevsky's cosmos, none of these paths, when taken to the extreme, can lead to peace or truth. The path of pure intellect leads to alienation and nihilism. Yvonne, the path of pure passion, leads to chaos and destruction. Rogozin, the only path to genuine spiritual harmony, the profound tranquility Dostoevsky seeks to offer, is the one chosen by Alyosha and Sonia. The integration of passion and intellect, harnessed by humility, faith, and active love, this is the only way to transform the terrifying freedom of the will into a life of purpose and moral integrity. The grand synthesis integrating intellect, passion, and spirit, having dissected the pathologies of the intellect, Ivan Raskolnikov, the underground man, and the dangers of unbridled passion, Dmitri Rogozin, Dostoevsky's complete philosophy, offers a grand synthesis, a way to reconcile the human spirit's terrifying freedom with its desperate need for moral anchors, an ultimate meaning. The solution is not found in the rejection of one faculty for another, but in the harmonious integration of all three primary forces of the human soul: reason, intellect. The intellect must be used, but with humility. It must recognize its own limits, that it cannot solve the problem of evil. Ivan's challenge, or logically justify morality. Raskolnikov's error. The intellect's highest function is not to deconstruct meaning, but to identify the truth embodied in love and faith. Will, passion, sense. The passions must be acknowledged as a potent force, but they must be sublimated and redirected. Dmitri's journey shows that the overwhelming, sensual energy, the Karamazov force, can be transformed from a destructive chaos into an intense, active energy for spiritual good and shared suffering. Passion is redirected from self-gratification to self-sacrifice, spirit, faith, love. This is the transcendent anchor. Faith, in Dostoevsky's view, is not blind belief, but the existential choice to trust in the ultimate goodness and meaning of life, despite the evidence of suffering and chaos. Ivan's proof. This choice must be expressed as active love, the willingness to step outside the self and take responsibility for the sins and suffering of others. Sonia's and Zauzima's mandate. This synthesis creates the ideal Dostoevskian figure, one who possesses the intellectual depth to understand nihilism, the passionate capacity to suffer, and the spiritual strength to choose compassion. over despair. This is the redeemed soul, achieving peace not by avoiding the battle, but by winning the inner war. The profound tranquility offered by Dostoevsky is not the simple relaxation of an untroubled mind, but the existential peace and choosing the path of moral integrity that comes only after facing the abyss of freedom. Conclusion: the eternal message of Dostoevsky. The timeless relevance of Dostoevsky's work lies in its unwavering focus on the eternal questions that underpin modern existence. He diagnosed the spiritual sickness of the 20th and 21st centuries, the isolation born of excessive intellect, and the chaos stemming from the loss of transcendental meaning, with unparalleled clarity. The warning against reductionism. Dostoevsky's entire body of work stands as a monumental warning against reductionism, the tendency to reduce the human being to a mere biological, economic, or psychological machine. He warns against any philosophy, political system, or scientific theory that attempts to diminish the complex, contradictory, and divine nature of the free human soul. Any system that promises to eliminate and chaos by eliminating freedom will inevitably lead to a far greater, colder tyranny. The triumph of the free will. Ultimately, Dostoevsky's message is one of radical hope, and the triumph of the individual. Free will, he demonstrates, through the suffering and ultimate redemption of his heroes, Dmitri, that the path out of darkness is always available. It is never too late to choose the light. This choice requires two core difficult acts: public humility, the willingness to confess, to stand at the crossroads, fight and accept one's sin and responsibility before all humanity, active service, the dedication of one's life force to the service and love of others, thereby transforming personal suffering into universal atonement. The peace that Dostoevsky offers is the peace of reconciliation. Reconciliation with one's own dark side, reconciliation with the irrationality of the world, and reconciliation with the divine mystery that transcends all human logic. As you conclude this journey through his deepest philosophical thoughts, may you find comfort in the complexity of your own soul. Recognize your freedom as your most sacred burden, and know that even in the deepest darkness, to choose love and forgiveness remains absolutely, terrifyingly, and beautifully yours. Drift now into the deep, restorative sleep that comes from a mind, finally, at peace with the profound mysteries of existence.